Welcome to History and Politics with Dr. Brovkin. Today, my dear friends and subscribers and visitors to my channel, I'd like to talk about Zelensky's visit to Washington and Putin's latest pronouncements. But when you put two and two together, they do add up to very significant conclusions one can draw about what's going on in the Russian-Ukraine war and what is to be expected. Now, the first item on the agenda is, of course, Zelensky's visit to Washington, and that requires a discussion of what he wanted to bring to Washington, what he wanted to present to President Trump as, of course, in the best possible light, the achievements of Ukraine in its war against Russia. And the plan was to show, of course, that Ukraine was winning in a sense that it has hundreds and hundreds of hits every day, that hundreds of drones fly to Russia, that they deliver devastating blows, and all of that is in this rhetoric to bring Russia to the negotiating table. That's the official position. Now, what has been happening, of course, there were two important things. That is that not only the refineries were hit, but yesterday, for example, there were 186 drones flying to Moscow, and of those, the vast majority, as always, were intercepted, but several did go through. And what they hit, the mayor of Moscow showed the photograph. One of them hit an apartment building and killed a woman. Now that is very, very important because it shows what these drones are. They are paper, well, not exactly paper, but they're wood. They're wooden drones with Chinese little engines, and there's lots of them. And that when they hit a target, it's minuscule but painful. That's why I call them mosquito bites. Yes, it is very painful in a sense that a woman was killed. But when you look at the huge apartment building and there's just a hit is when one window is broken and the drone got inside and then exploded and killed a civilian. Strictly speaking, that is a war crime because this is a deliberate attack on civilian targets to intimidate population. Moreover, Zelensky openly says that the purpose is to make Russians suffer. The second hit last week that got a lot of Western attention was attacking on the storage facilities of wild berries, which is the name of a Russian analog to Amazon. That is a company that delivers goods and services, well, mostly goods, packages to Russian public. The purpose was, of course, also to inflict pain in Russia, to inflict damage to Russian economy. And that was the plan to inflict so much pain that the Russians would raise their hands and plead for mercy and sit on the negotiating table. Now, this is so naive and so absurd to think that with these kinds of hits, Russia would go to the negotiating table. It's just simply laughable because the result, as I will show you in a minute, was the exact opposite. But what was Russian response? I already talked about it, but I will repeat. The response to the drone offensive was to destroy the drones and to destroy the factories that produce them and to destroy any port facilities that ship and receive ships coming from abroad. So in the last 2 weeks, the Russians really took the gloves off and they were devastating attacks on not on civilians, but on industry in Ukraine, in Kiev. And there are lists and lists of factories that one can read those lists in the Ministry of Defense website. But most importantly, this was the total destruction of the Odessa port. And the Russians really showed that they are serious when they attacked not just the port facilities, but ships themselves. Who could say it? They play a la Iran. one Turkish ship was destroyed, and then there was a ship that had Indian crew, and 4 Indians died, and the Indians protested in an official démarche, but the Russians responded that they shouldn't be carrying military supplies to a country at war. In other words, the offensive the drone offensive that Zelensky and the Western media boasted so much actually did more damage to Ukraine and its ability to survive than it could possibly do by making Russia fearful and agreeing to accept Ukrainian demands in the negotiations. Now, another important event in this time, prior to the visit to the United States, was a Ukrainian offensive on the cargo ships, not just oil tankers, but the Russian grain shipments. For your information, Russia is the biggest grain exporter in the world, bigger than the United States. And it has, these were just container ships going peacefully through the Sea of Azov, and then all of a sudden they were not protected. Obviously, they were hit by Ukrainian drones. Now, the result, of course, is that Russia just stopped any Ukrainian exports of grain. You hit our grain export, we hit yours. So this was a response, but as a result, Ukraine cannot export any grain anywhere except perhaps by rail, which is extremely difficult in view of Polish opposition and restrictions of the European Union. So once again, Zelensky's policies did more harm to Ukraine than it did inflicting pain on Russia. Then I don't want to get into the military specifics, but there were several new developments that the Russians reported in their struggle with the drone attacks, and several anti-drone drones were developed. One of them is called Banderol, which means a small package. Which is, then there were the Gerain 4 optic guided missiles, well, not missiles, optic guided drones with turbo jet engines. But I leave it to military specialists. For me, the political aspects are more important, and what the latest developments showed was well revealed in Putin's 2 important meetings in the last few days. There was a meeting with the officers of the Navy, and there was a meeting with the Duma, the members of the Russian parliament at the end of its session, which is just last night or 2 days ago. And Putin said some very important things in regard to future of Ukraine and revealed some of his strategic thinking. So as far as the naval officers are concerned, he spoke about the role of the Navy in the Arctic and in protecting Russian cargo ships. And so he said that what the European Union is doing is, of course, totally illegal, and that is piracy, and that he entrusted it to the Russian Navy to escort or to defend Russian cargo ships with any means they have. In other words, this is pretty much a permission to shoot if there is any attempt to seize Russian ships, and to, as what the Europeans has decided to do in the latest package of sanctions. So the response is swift and drastic. And of course, the lawyers say that the international law is on Russia's side, because a country can seize somebody else's vessel if it is in a state of war. But none of the European countries, not even Ukraine, is officially in a state of war with Russia. Therefore, any seizure of Russian ships on high seas is a crime. And therefore, Russia is totally entitled, it is a matter of self-defense, to shoot at any attempt. And those who do attempt to seize or harm Russian cargo vessels, be it with oil or grain or anything else. And that's what he said in his meeting with the Russian officers. Another interesting event in this regard was during his meeting with the members of the Duma, and he was giving awards to various state officials for their achievements and this and that. And then when it was over, he shared with the audience, with all these members of Duma, that one of the persons he gave awards to just leaned over to him, to Putin, and whispered in his ear, "Why can't we go faster and braver?" And so Putin took this opportunity to, in a sense, respond to these comments that are discussed in Russian media and obviously in the Duma, why the Russians are going slowly. And Putin said very clearly, he said that we are going slowly, but we're going steadily, and we're going forward until all the goals of the special military operation will be fulfilled. And then he added those words he said before, until total victory. Now, just so there is no hopes, no second opinion as to what he meant by total victory, he spoke about Zelensky and about the leadership in Ukraine. And he called them spiders in a jar. He referred to the infighting in Ukraine in connection with the firing of the Minister of Defense Fedorov, and he said these are the thieves who are dividing up stolen money, and they are cooped up in a jar like spiders, and they're eating up each other in order to get more money. So this is, of course, shows total disrespect to Zelensky, and it indicates that, as I mentioned many times before, the Russian leadership does not have any desire for any negotiation with Zelensky regime at all. And what they're talking about now is total victory. Now, again, there was only a hint as to what total victory may be. By the way, when the Duma heard these words, they began to applaud energetically. So there was a total unanimity of all the parties in the Duma in their desire to conduct the war until total victory. In a sense, this is also a result of the drone warfare. In other words, the only thing Zelensky won by the drone attacks on civilian targets is unify all of Russia, the Duma members, the generals, the general public, not to surrender and to conclude peace at whatever cost, but the determination to smash Zelensky regime to smithereens and a crushing blow and achieve a total victory. And finally, my dear friends, there was another interesting episode. This one was with the naval officers. And he was asked a question about why the neo-Nazis, the Bandera types, why they hate Russia so much, even though they are a part of Russia and have been a part of Russia for centuries. And so he had to explain to a soldier, why do they hate us so much? And Putin gave a kind of a historic, as he likes to do. He goes on for 10 minutes or 15 minutes discussing the history of Ukraine. And basically what it boiled down to is that these Bandera followers were the people who fought with Hitler. They fought with the Nazis, against the Russians, against the Jews, against the Poles, and those that praise them now are their followers. In their crooked mind, they believe that these are the true Ukrainians. And then Putin said that, look, the only way Ukraine can have its statehood and its independence is only if it is guaranteed by Russia. not by NATO, not by Trump, and not by the European Union. And this was historically so. So his answer, it was very clear. I deduce it like this, that Putin's vision, yeah, I'm sorry, there was one last episode. And then somebody asked, what about the Western Ukraine? And this is the hotbed of nationalism and of Bandera movement. And for the first time, what Putin said, these territories, he called them Stalin's gift. Basically, this was the territories that were carved out of the neighboring countries and given to Soviet Ukraine by Comrade Stalin in 1945. A piece of Hungary, a piece of Slovakia, a piece of Poland, and a piece of Romania. And so this is Putin put it like this: these territories will go back to their original states. Now that's the first time that I hear this, that in fact he envisions that Western Ukraine will be divided up and there won't be any Western Ukraine. It would be going back to the original owners. So let me sum up like this. My conclusion from what I hear Putin saying is the following: no deals with the current regime. There will be a change of Zelensky's regime, or the Bandera regime in Ukraine. There will be a return of historically Russian territories to the Russian Federation. And the fate of the remainder of Ukraine will be determined on the battlefield, and it will not be anything but a state friendly to Russia, not a staging ground for attacks by the collective West against Russia. This is it for today, my dear friends. I want to invite you to read my book, From Lenin to Putin, to read, if you are more into reading, my Substack, and also to listen to read some of my comments on X, Twitter. And on that, I will end and thank you for your attention. Please put likes if you do, and I will see you very shortly. Thank you. Bye-bye.